The sickening smell of rotting garbage filled John's nostrils as he rummaged through the trash can, his calloused hands shaking from both the bitter morning chill and the hunger that consumed him. Suddenly, his fingers touched something solid. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box. His heart raced as he opened the box, revealing a dazzling collection of jewelry and gold coins. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The dingy alley disappeared, replaced by visions of comfortable beds, hot meals, and a life free from the crushing burden of homelessness. But as reality set in, a nagging question began to plague his mind. What would the true price of this newfound wealth be? The bitter Chicago winter wind cut through John's wool coat as he walked down the dimly lit alley, each step weighing on his aching 45-year-old bones. The first rays of sunlight barely penetrated the urban canyon of skyscrapers, casting long shadows that seemed to mock his existence. John rubbed his calloused hands together, trying to generate some warmth as he examined the row of dumpsters lining the alley. This daily search for food and anything useful had become his routine for the past 2 years, a stark contrast to the life he knew. As he approached the first dumpster, its rusty hinges groaning in protest as he lifted the lid, his mind wandered to happier times. Just 5 years ago, John had it all: a loving wife, 2 beautiful children, and a promising career as a financial analyst at a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago. Now, he was reduced to a daily struggle for survival, searching through the dumpsters for anything that might give him a second chance or at least some relief from the misery that had become his reality. He lived in a comfortable home in the suburb of Neal, drove a fancy car, and never worried about where his next meal would come from. Life seemed perfect, or so he believed. The first sign of trouble came when his company underwent a major restructuring. John's department was one of the hardest hit, and despite his years of dedication and impeccable performance reviews, he ended up among those laid off. "It's nothing personal," his manager said, avoiding John's eyes, "just business." At first, John remained optimistic. With his vast experience and skills, he was confident that he would soon find a new job. But as the weeks turned into months, the rejections began to pile up, and his savings quickly dwindled. The stress began to take a toll on his marriage. "You need to try harder, John," his wife Sarah would say, her voice thick with frustration and fear. "The bills are piling up, and the kids need new clothes for school." John's self-esteem plummeted, and he turned to drinking to numb the pain of his failure, which only made his problems at home worse. Arguments became more frequent, and the loving glances between him and Sarah were replaced by cold expressions and charged silences. The day Sarah filed for divorce was when John's world truly fell apart. With nowhere to go, John moved in on a friend's couch, trying to rebuild his life. However, the combination of depression, alcoholism, and a gap in his employment history made it nearly impossible to find work. One by one, his friends stopped returning his calls. Child support payments drained what little money he had left, and eventually, with no other alternative, John found himself on the streets of Chicago, just another anonymous face in the city's growing homeless population. What had once been a comfortable life had become a daily struggle for survival, and John now wandered the streets, carrying the weight of his past and the uncertainty of an increasingly bleak future. Now, as John rummaged through the trash can, he tried desperately to push away the memories of his previous life. He needed to focus on survival, on getting through another day in this unforgiving urban jungle. His stomach growled, reminding him of the real reason for this morning's search. The first trash can he opened yielded nothing but soggy cardboard and rotten food. Determined, John moved on to the next, hoping to find something of value. As he lifted the lid, a sickening odor filled the air, nearly making him gag. But after years on the streets, he had hardened himself. He took a deep breath, stifling his disgust, and reached into the pile of trash, sifting through the refuse. Suddenly, his fingers touched something solid, different from the usual soft crunch of scraps or the rough edges of discarded packaging. Intrigued, John pushed aside a layer of trash, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. His heart began to beat faster as he carefully removed the box from the can. It was the size of a thick hardback book, its surface adorned with delicate floral patterns. Despite being among the trash, the box looked surprisingly clean and in pristine condition. With trembling hands, John opened the lid. What he saw inside took his breath away. Nestled on a bed of velvet were several glittering jewels, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, along with a handful of gold coins that looked like they had come from a pirate's treasure chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The dingy alley faded from his mind, replaced by visions of warm beds, satisfying meals, and a life free from the crushing burden of homelessness. John's mind began to imagine the possibilities. With this treasure, he could rent an apartment, buy new clothes, and perhaps even reconnect with his children. But as the initial shock wore off, an uneasy feeling began to form in his stomach. Where had this box come from? Surely someone must be looking for it. And if he kept it, wouldn't that make him a thief? John glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how exposed he was in the alley. Quickly, he closed the lid of the box and hid it inside his coat, zipping it up to protect the unexpected treasure that now weighed on his conscience as much as it did on his chest. John's heart was pounding in his chest as he tried to appear normal, continuing down the alley as if nothing had happened. But his mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Part of him wanted to run to the nearest pawn shop and turn his newfound wealth into cash. Another part, however, whispered that this might be a trap or even a cruel joke. And there was still an inner voice, which John identified as his father's, reminding him of the values he had been raised with: honesty, integrity, and the importance of doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. John wandered aimlessly through the city streets, barely noticing the hurried pedestrians and honking taxis around him. He ended up in a park, collapsing on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan. The box seemed to weigh even more heavily against his chest, a physical reminder of the moral burden he now carried. As the morning sun rose, warming his face, John was faced with the most difficult decision he had faced in years. This treasure could be his escape from the streets, the chance to regain at least a part of the life he had lost. But at what cost? He thought of his children, now teenagers, and how disappointed they would be to know that their father had taken something that was not his. He thought of Sarah, his ex-wife, and how this would only serve to confirm her worst opinions of the man he had become. Still, the temptation persisted. After so many years of suffering and humiliation on the streets, didn't John deserve a break after all? Wasn't this the universe finally giving him a chance at redemption? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, John noticed a newspaper lying next to him on the bench. The headline caught his eye: "Local family devastated by theft of priceless heirloom." With trembling hands, he unfolded the newspaper and began to read, his heart sinking with each word. The story described a robbery at the home of a prominent Chicago family, the centerpiece of which was a small, ornate wooden box containing precious coins and jewelry. A family treasure, passed down from generation to generation. Reality hit John like a punch to the gut. The box that now lay hidden beneath his tattered coat was not only valuable, it was priceless to someone. It represented a family's legacy, its stories, its memories. All of it lay in that box that, not long ago, he had found in the trash. Now, John was faced with a choice that would define who he truly was and who he would become. As he gazed out over the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, John felt the weight of his decision become almost unbearable. He was at a crucial point in his life, where the path ahead of him split into two distinct directions. On one side was the temptation of immediate comfort and financial security. On the other, an uncertain future, but with a clear conscience and preserved integrity. With a deep sigh, John stood up from the bench, the decision already formed in his mind. However, before he could take the first step, a gruff voice sounded behind him. "Hey you. What do you have under your coat?" John turned quickly and saw two police officers approaching, their eyes fixed on the suspicious bulge under his jacket. In that instant, he understood that his next actions would be decisive, shaping not only his future, but also the essence of the man he wanted to be, or still hoped to be. His heart raced as the officers approached, and in a moment of pure tension, John slowly raised his hands, his voice shaking as he finally spoke. "Officers, I've found something that I think may be stolen property." The next few hours passed in a blur. John was taken to the local police station, where he handed over the ornate box and explained his story to a detective who was eyeing him skeptically. To his surprise, the detective seemed more interested in solving the original theft case than questioning John's temporary ownership of the item. "Look, we appreciate your honesty," the detective said, leaning back in his chair. "The Aldridge family will be relieved to have their inheritance back. As for you, consider this a warning. Next time you find anything valuable, bring it directly to us. You're free to go." John staggered out of the police station, a mixture of relief and regret washing over him. He knew he had done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the bitter feeling that his chance to escape homelessness had disappeared. As he wandered the streets of Chicago's Loop, the weight of his decision began to sink in. The sun was setting when John found himself in front of the Pacific Garden Mission, one of the city's largest homeless shelters. For the past few months, he had avoided shelters, preferring the dangerous freedom of the streets to the cramped, often chaotic conditions of these places. But that night, exhausted and emotionally drained, John decided to try something different. As he approached the entrance, a kind-faced woman in her 60s greeted him with a warm smile. The name tag on her chest revealed her name, Margaret. "First time here, are you?" the woman asked, her eyes crinkling gently at the corners. John nodded, suddenly aware of his worn, disheveled appearance. "Well, you're in luck," Margaret continued in a welcoming tone. "We have a few beds left tonight. Come on in, and we'll get you settled." Inside the shelter, John was greeted by a sight of constant movement. Men and women of all ages milled about, some lining up for dinner while others prepared to rest in their assigned beds. The air was filled with a melange of odors, the sweet-sour smell of sweaty bodies, the strong aroma of industrial cleaning products, and the unmistakable scent of simple food prepared in bulk. As Margaret guided John through the intake process, he couldn't help but catch snippets of the conversations going on around him. Voices whispered about the closing of campgrounds under the expressway, about a new jobs program that would begin next week with a sobriety requirement, and about a family offering a reward for the recovery of stolen property. That last comment made John's ears perk up. He turned to the speaker, a thin, wiry, elderly man. "What was that about a reward?" John asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The man, who introduced himself as Eddie, seemed content to explain. "Oh, yes, it's all over the news. Some wealthy family had their jewelry box stolen. They're offering a generous reward for information. Too bad none of us will stumble upon something like that." John felt his stomach churn. He had been so focused on doing the right thing that he hadn't even considered the possibility of a reward. The chance to solve his financial problems while still maintaining his integrity was something that had never crossed his mind. As he settled into his assigned bed, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had lost the opportunity to earn a significant amount of money, but on the other hand, he had preserved his moral compass. that had to count for something in a world where greed and selfishness seemed to be rewarded. The next morning, John woke early, his body aching from a night on the shelter's thin mattress. Walking to the common area, he overheard Margaret talking to another volunteer. The Aldridge family will be coming later to tour the facility. They're thinking about making a sizable donation after they recover their inheritance. Imagine what we could do with that kind of funding. John froze, his heart pounding. The Aldridge family, the true owners of the box he had found, were coming. He considered slipping away unnoticed, but something made him stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a desire to find closure to the whole situation. As he poured himself a bowl of warm oatmeal, his thoughts wandered to his own family. What were his children doing now? Did they think of him? The chasm between his present life and what had once been his reality seemed unbridgeable. His reverie was abruptly interrupted by a commotion at the shelter's entrance. A well-dressed couple, flanked by a personal assistant and a security guard, had arrived. The woman, elegant in a tailored suit, clutched a familiar, ornate box to her chest. "That's them," Eddie whispered, suddenly appearing at John's side, a meaningful look in his eyes. Beside him, Mr. Aldridge looked relieved, as if they had finally recovered his precious box. John watched as Margaret greeted the couple warmly, giving them a tour of the facility. He couldn't help but notice how Mrs. Aldridge's eyes darted nervously around the room, her grip on the box tightening whenever one of the shelter's residents came a little closer. As the group approached the common area, John felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to speak. Before he could stop himself, he stood up and cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. I was the one who found your box." The once noisy room fell silent, and all eyes turned to John, who suddenly felt small, self-conscious in his worn, ill-fitting clothes. Mrs. Aldridge's eyes widened in recognition as her husband approached, his expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Were you responsible?" Mr. Aldridge asked, his voice carrying the politeness of someone accustomed to power and money. "The police mentioned that someone had returned it, but they didn't give us any details." John nodded, unsure of what to say. To his surprise, Mrs. Aldridge handed the box to her assistant and approached John, her eyes shining with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "This box has been in our family for generations. When it was stolen, I felt like I lost a part of myself. You have no idea what this means to us." As she spoke, John realized that Mr. Aldridge was deep in hushed conversation with his assistant. After a moment, he joined his wife, checkbook in hand. "We'd like to offer you a reward," Mr. Aldridge said, beginning to write a check. "It's the least we can do to show our appreciation." John stared at the checkbook, his mind spinning. This was the solution to all his problems, offered so simply and unexpectedly. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the shelter on him, the air thick with their bated breath, waiting for his answer. But as he opened his mouth to accept, John caught his reflection in a nearby window. The man staring back at him looked old and worn, but there was something else in his eyes, a spark of who he used to be, of the values he once held dear. It was in that moment that John made a decision that would change the course of his life once again. "I really appreciate the offer," he said, his voice growing firmer with each word. "But I cannot accept a reward for doing what any decent person should do. If you truly wish to show your gratitude, I would ask that you consider making a donation to this shelter. There are many good people here who could greatly benefit from such help." The room was filled with murmurs of surprise and admiration, reflecting the collective emotion that filled the room. Margaret gave John an encouraging smile, while Eddie patted him proudly on the back. Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge exchanged a look of astonishment, and then Mr. Aldridge broke into a broad smile. "Well," he said, tearing up the partially filled-out check, I think we can do better than a donation. How about a job, Mr. Baker? John could hardly believe his ears. As Mrs. Aldridge began to describe a position at one of her companies, he felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, a glimmer of hope rose within him, not just for a chance at a new beginning, but for the possibility of redemption, of reclaiming the man he had once been. But as he shook Mr. Aldridge's hand and accepted the incredible offer, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. The road ahead would be challenging. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt, and the demons that had led to his homelessness would not be exorcised so easily. As the Aldridges prepared to leave, arranging the details for John to begin his new position, he caught snippets of conversation from the other residents of the shelter. Some offered sincere congratulations, while others showed a subtle hint of envy. But it was Eddie's words that echoed in his mind. "You're a lucky one, John," Eddie said, his eyes reflecting a mix of admiration and something darker. "But don't forget where you came from. This world has a way of knocking you down just when you think you've made it." John nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle on his shoulders as he watched the Aldridges leave, their promises of a new life still ringing in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest challenges were yet to come. Over the next few weeks, John's life was turned upside down by a whirlwind of change. True to their word, the Aldridges found him a job with one of their companies, a mid-level position in the maintenance department of Aldridge Properties, a real estate company that specialized in commercial buildings throughout Chicago. One day, John found himself standing in front of the mirror in his small studio apartment, adjusting his tie. The face reflected back at him was cleaner and healthier, but his eyes still held a trace of disbelief. He could barely recognize himself in the clean, pressed clothes, so different from the tattered clothes he wore on the streets. As he prepared to leave for work, John's gaze fell on a small box on his nightstand. Inside was the first paycheck he had received in years, along with a handwritten note from Mrs. Aldridge expressing her continued gratitude. The money was a lifeline, but it was the note that John treasured most, a tangible reminder that someone believed in him. The morning commute on the L train was still a novelty for John. He found himself watching his fellow passengers, wondering if any of them could guess that just a month earlier, he had been one of the homeless people they had hurried past on the streets. At the Aldridge Estates, John threw himself into his work with a fervor born of gratitude and determination. He arrived early, stayed late, and performed each task with meticulous care. His supervisors noticed his dedication, and soon whispers began to circulate about a possible promotion. But as the initial euphoria of his new circumstances began to fade, John found himself grappling with unexpected challenges. The habits and fears ingrained by years of living on the streets did not disappear overnight. He began hoarding food in his apartment, overcome by an irrational fear that his next meal might not arrive. Loud noises still made John wince, remnants of sleepless nights in dangerous alleys. Despite his new wardrobe and address, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he didn't belong in this world of corporate politics and casual conversations around the water cooler. It was a Friday night, and as John was finishing up some paperwork, he heard a heated argument in the office next door. "I'm telling you, something's not right with the Fullerton Avenue property," a male voice insisted with conviction. John recognized it as Mark, one of the junior accountants. "Lower your voice," another voice hissed urgently. It was David, John's supervisor. "Look, I don't know what you think you found, but I suggest you forget it. The seniors don't like people sticking their noses where they don't belong." John froze, his hand hovering over the mouse, as the conversation continued with Mark protesting and David growing increasingly irritated. Finally, there was the sound of a drawer slamming shut and hurried footsteps leaving the office. Heart pounding, John pretended to focus on his computer screen as David walked past, his face still flushed with anger. Once the coast was clear, John let out a shaky breath. What had he just heard? Throughout the weekend, John couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the conversation had left him with. He owed the Aldridges everything: his job, his apartment, his second chance at life. But the tone of that conversation, the veiled threat, didn't feel right. On Monday morning, John arrived at work to find the office abuzz with gossip. Mark, the junior accountant, had resigned unexpectedly, citing personal reasons. As John settled into his desk, he noticed David watching him closely, a calculating look in his eyes. "John," David called, "I need you to come to my office." Feeling apprehensive, John followed his supervisor. Once inside, David closed the door and fixed John with a stern look. "I'll be blunt," David began. "You've been doing a good job, and the higher-ups have noticed. There's been talk of moving you to a more sensitive position, but before that happens, I need to know where your loyalties lie." John swallowed. "I'm loyal to the company, of course," he said carefully. David nodded slowly. "Good, because sometimes in this business we come across information that can be misinterpreted by outsiders, information that's best kept within the family, so to speak. Do you understand?" The implication was clear, and John felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He thought of the Aldridges' generosity, of the second chance they'd given him, but he also thought of the values he'd regained, the integrity he'd fought so hard to maintain, even in his darkest moments. "I see," John said, keeping his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. David looked pleased. "Excellent. I think you'll fit in very well here, John. Keep up the good work, and who knows, you might just move up very quickly." As John left David's office, his mind was spinning. He had worked hard to rebuild his life, to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. But now, he found himself at a crossroads, forced to choose between his gratitude to the Aldridges and his own moral compass. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, staring at Mrs. Aldridge's thank you note, John made a decision. With shaking hands, John turned on his laptop, which he rarely used, and began to search. He couldn't stop thinking about the Fullerton Avenue property that had been mentioned in the conversation he had overheard. Determined to find out more, he combed through public records and read news articles, looking for any relevant information. What he found made his blood run cold. There were glaring discrepancies in the property's appraisal, signs that safety inspections had been rushed, and rumors of political favors being given to ease zoning issues. While it wasn't hard evidence of corruption, it was enough to raise serious suspicions. John leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair as he thought. He thought about his children, about the kind of role model he wanted to be for them. He thought about the people he had met at the shelter, about Margaret's kindness and Eddie's cynical warnings. He thought about the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. As the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, John made his decision. He would investigate further, gather all the evidence he could, and then, no matter what the cost, he would do what was right. But when he finally went to bed, exhausted after a night of intense moral struggle and amateurish sleuthing, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of a precipice. He knew that the path he had chosen would be difficult and that any slip-up could have devastating consequences. For the next few weeks, John lived a constant balancing act. During the day, he continued to perform his job at Aldridge Properties with mastery, earning praise from his superiors and strengthening his position within the company. But at night, he delved deeper and deeper into the shady dealings involving the Fullerton Avenue property and other Aldridge assets. As his investigation progressed, the weight of his secret became increasingly difficult to bear. He found himself increasingly paranoid, startled by the slightest noise and fearful that his nocturnal activities would be discovered. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. John had finally achieved the stability he had so desired, only to risk everything in search of the truth. One crisp autumn morning, John arrived at his office to find an invitation lying on his desk. The Aldridges were hosting a charity gala at their luxurious mansion, and to his surprise, he was among the employees invited. The invitation was a clear sign of his growing prestige within the company, but it also represented an opportunity he couldn't pass up. That week, as he nervously adjusted his rented tuxedo in the foyer of the imposing Aldridge mansion, John felt completely out of place. The opulence around him was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers glittered in the light, priceless works of art adorned the walls, and Chicago's elite milled about the room, chatting as they sipped champagne and sampled delicate canapés. It all seemed like a world far removed from the cardboard box he had called home just a few months earlier. "John, I'm so glad you could come." Mrs. Aldridge's warm voice cut through the room as she approached him, resplendent in her elegant gown, with her husband at her side. "Thank you for inviting me," John replied, shaking Mr. Aldridge's hand, who was smiling. "This is quite an event." "Well, you've become an important part of our organization," Mr. Aldridge replied, patting him on the shoulder. "We take care of our own here." As the couple walked away to greet other guests, John couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. These people had given him a second chance at life, and here he was, secretly investigating them. The evening wore on, and John found himself engaged in conversations with various city executives and officials, listening intently and mentally storing every scrap of information that might be useful to his investigation. But as he moved through the event, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him alone. In a lull in the festivities, he excused himself and quietly left the main hall. His heart pounded as he walked through the silent halls of the mansion. He knew it was risky, but he also knew he might never have another opportunity like this. After a few turns through the halls, John came across what appeared to be Mr. Aldridge's office. He hesitated for a moment, but then decided to enter, closing the door softly behind him. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a computer monitor left on. With shaking hands, John approached the desk, telling himself that he was only looking for evidence of wrongdoing, that this was for the greater good. However, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was betraying the people who had rescued him. As he sifted through the papers on the desk, something caught his eye, a familiar name. Fullerton Avenue. John felt his breath catch in his throat. As John scanned the document in his hands, he realized he was looking at a detailed memo that revealed the use of substandard materials in the construction of a property. The document also listed the inspectors who had been bribed to overlook the irregularities. Halfway through his reading, an unexpected voice interrupted his thoughts. "That's interesting reading, isn't it?" John turned quickly to see David standing in the doorway, a dark smile on his face. "I had a feeling you'd try something like this," David continued, striding into the room with menacing confidence. "You've been asking a lot of questions, staying late at the office. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" John's mind raced for an excuse, some explanation, but before he could say anything, David held up his hand, cutting off any attempt at a response. "Put that away," David said, his voice sharp. "I'll make it simple for you, John. You're in way over your head here. The Aldridges pulled you out of the gutter, gave you everything you have now, and this is how you repay them." David's words hit John like a punch to the gut. He thought of the dark days he'd spent in the homeless shelter, the despair he'd felt before he'd received Aldridge's mysterious box. For a brief moment, John hesitated, and David, sensing his uncertainty, pressed on. "Look, I get it. You have a conscience, and that's admirable, but let me tell you something. In this world, conscience is a luxury few can afford. Do you really want to go back to the streets?" Because that's where you'll end up if you keep this up. John's mind raced to his children, to the hope of reconnecting with them now that his life was in order. He thought of the warm bed that awaited him in his apartment, of the dignity he felt in working an honest job. Was he really willing to sacrifice all that? As if he could read his thoughts, David pressed further. It doesn't have to be this way, John. You've proven yourself to the company. Play along with us, and you'll go far. Who knows, one day you might end up in this very house, hosting your own galas. All you have to do is forget what you saw here tonight. The temptation was overwhelming. John could feel his resolve crumbling. It would be so easy to give in, to accept the comfort and security that was being offered. After everything he'd been through, didn't he deserve some peace? But then, out of nowhere, a memory flashed into his mind. John saw himself standing at the police station, delivering Aldridge's box. He remembered what it felt like to do the right thing, even when it cost him dearly. He thought of Margaret at the shelter, exhausted but still helping others without expecting anything in return. And he thought of his children, of the example he wanted to set for them. In that moment, John made his choice. "I'm sorry, David," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "But I can't just ignore this. What's happening here is wrong. People could get hurt." David's face hardened, losing its feigned sympathy. "I'm disappointed, John. I really thought you were smarter than that," he said, pulling a small tape recorder from his jacket. "Did you know your apartment is bugged? We have some very interesting recordings of your late-night research sessions. I wonder what the police would make of a former homeless man breaking into his employer's private files." John felt the blood drain from his face. He had been tricked, trapped by his own good intentions. "So here's what's going to happen," David continued with eerie calm. "You're going to walk out of this room with me. We're going to go back to the party, and you're going to smile and pretend like everything's fine. Tomorrow, you're going to come to work as usual and forget everything you've seen or heard about Fullerton Avenue or any other Aldridge property. Is that clear?" John stood frozen, feeling the weight of his decision crush him. Everything he had worked for, all the hard work he had put into rebuilding his life, seemed about to crumble. Yet the alternative of ignoring the corruption and the impending danger was simply unimaginable. In that critical moment, John realized that the true test of his character was not in refusing the reward for the information box or working diligently at his new job. It was, in fact, right here, facing the loss of everything he had gained, but with the chance to do what he knew was right. "No," John said, at first in a whisper, but then repeated in a firmer tone. "No, we don't understand each other. I'm not going to be a part of this." David's eyes narrowed with a mixture of surprise and anger. "You're making a huge mistake, John. You have no idea what you're up against." "Maybe," John replied, feeling a strange calm come over him. "But I know who I am, and I'm not the kind of man to turn my back on something like that." Before David could respond, the office door opened, revealing Mr. Aldridge, who stepped into the room with an expression that was hard to read. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. John and David exchanged quick glances, the tension in the air almost palpable. In that moment, John knew that whatever happened next would change the course of his life forever. But this time, he was prepared to face the uncertainty head-on, certain that he had chosen to be the man he wanted to be, no matter the consequences. The silence in Mr. Aldridge's office was overwhelming as he looked from John to David, his expression unreadable. "I believe I asked you a question," Mr. Aldridge said, his voice low and controlled. "What exactly is going on here?" Before David could open his mouth to respond, John stepped forward. His heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. "Mr. Aldridge, I have discovered some troubling information about the property on Fullerton Avenue. There are security issues that have been covered up, and I believe people's lives may be at risk. David's face twisted in anger. He's lying, sir. John broke into your office, is snooping around, and is trying to sabotage the company. We must call the police immediately. Mr. Aldridge held up his hand, silencing David with a gesture, his eyes fixed on John's face. Is this true, John? Are you investigating my company? John took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment of truth. Yes, sir. I am. But only because I stumbled upon information that I could not ignore. You gave me a second chance when no one else would, and for that I owe you everything. But I cannot stand by while people's lives are at stake. For a long moment, Mr. Aldridge remained silent. Then, to John and David's surprise, he let out a low chuckle. It seems I made the right choice in hiring you, John. David's mouth fell open. Sir, I have suspected for some time that there was something wrong with our operations, Mr. Aldridge said firmly. I brought John into the company precisely because I expected him to have the integrity to bring any problems to light. And it appears my trust was not misplaced. John stood in stunned silence as Mr. Aldridge walked to his desk and picked up the phone. Security, please come to my office immediately and contact the authorities. We have serious matters to discuss. The next few hours were a whirlwind. The police arrived, statements were taken, and documents were seized. John watched silently as David, along with other executives implicated in the scheme, were led away in handcuffs. As dawn broke in Chicago, John found himself sitting in a small conference room with Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge. They both looked exhausted but resolute. John, Mrs. Aldridge began, her voice soft, we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Your actions tonight may have saved lives. Mr. Aldridge nodded, adding, when we met you, we saw a man who had hit rock bottom but still chose to do the right thing. Tonight, you proved that character once again. But I have to ask, why risk it all? You knew what you stood to lose. John thought for a moment before answering. When I was homeless, I lost so much more than just my belongings. I also lost my self-respect and my sense of purpose. You gave me the chance to get those things back, and I couldn't just throw them all away, even if it meant losing everything else. The Aldridges exchanged a knowing look, and Mr. Aldridge said, well, I think it's clear that we need more people like you in this company. How would you feel about leading our new ethics and compliance department? John's head swam at the offer. It was more than he could have ever dreamed of, but a nagging doubt held him back. I'm honored, sir, but are you sure? Can you trust me after everything I've done behind your back? Mrs. Aldridge reached out and patted his hand gently. My dear, that's exactly why we trust you. You've shown that your integrity is not for sale at any price, and that's exactly what this company needs. As John walked out of the Aldridge building that morning, the rising sun cast a new light over the city. He felt different somehow, stronger, more self-assured. The demons of his past, addiction, self-doubt, fear of failure, seemed to have lost their grip on him. Over the next few weeks, John threw himself into his new role. He worked tirelessly to implement new supervision procedures and create safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. The work was challenging, but John found deep satisfaction in it. One cool fall afternoon, as John was leaving work, he spotted a familiar face on the street. It was Eddie, an old acquaintance from the shelter. Eddie's eyes widened in recognition. John, is that really you? Eddie asked, taking in John's tailored suit and confident bearing. John smiled warmly. It's me, Eddie. How are you? As they talked, John felt a surge of empathy for his old friend. Eddie was still struggling, trapped in the cycle of homelessness that John had managed to escape. An idea began to form in his mind. Eddie, he said, how would you feel about a job? It's an entry-level position, but it's honest work with room for growth. Eddie's eyes lit with a hope that John recognized well. "Are you serious, man? I'd do anything for a chance like that." As he helped Eddie fill out the job application, John felt a deep sense of closure. He had been given a second chance, and now he was in a position to offer the same opportunity to others. That night, when John walked into his apartment, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his daughter, the first contact he'd had with his children in years. With shaking hands, he opened the message. "Dad, I hear you're doing better. Maybe we could meet for coffee sometime." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he typed his response. "I'd love to. Please tell me the name, time, and place." As he sat on the couch, looking out at the Chicago skyline, John reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had faced his greatest fears, confronted his weaknesses, and emerged stronger for it. He had not only reclaimed his life, but also his sense of purpose and self-worth. John knew the challenges were far from over. Rebuilding his bond with his children would be an arduous journey. Maintaining his sobriety would require a daily commitment for the rest of his life, and his new role at Aldridge Properties would certainly present a host of new obstacles. But for the first time in years, John felt prepared to face whatever came his way. He had rediscovered his strength, his integrity, and his ability to thrive in the face of adversity. As he fell asleep that night, John Baker was no longer a man defined by the mistakes of his past, but rather by the choices he had made in the face of adversity. The next morning, the crisp autumn air caressed John's face as he waited outside a small cafe in Lincoln Park. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, both to ward off the chill and to hide the nervous tremors that gripped him. Today was a special day. He would be seeing his daughter, Sarah, for the first time in years. As he waited, his mind wandered back to the many changes that had occurred since that fateful night at the Aldridge mansion. The company had undergone a significant restructuring, with John leading the implementation of new ethical guidelines and transparency measures. The property on Fullerton Avenue had been thoroughly inspected and updated to meet safety codes, averting what could have been a disaster. But more than his professional triumphs, John valued his personal growth. He had managed to maintain his sobriety, finding strength in the support groups he had begun to attend regularly. His relationship with Eddie had blossomed, and John had become a mentor to his former friend, guiding him through the challenges of reintegrating into the workforce. A gentle touch on his shoulder brought John out of his thoughts. He turned to find Sarah standing before him, her eyes a mix of apprehension and hope. "Dad," she said, barely above a whisper, her voice thick with emotion. John's heart swelled with emotion. "Sarah," he murmured, fighting the urge to hug her immediately. "Thank you for coming." They entered the cafe, the awkward silence between them filled with the hustle and bustle of the baristas and customers around them. Sitting at a corner table with their coffees in hand, John took a deep breath and began. "Sarah, I know I have a lot to make up for," he said sincerely. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count, but I want you to know that there hasn't been a day that goes by that I haven't thought about you and your brother." Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug, revealing the pain she carried. "It was hard, Dad," she replied, her voice thick with sadness. "We didn't know if you were alive or dead. Our mother tried her best, but it wasn't the same." John nodded, accepting the pain in his daughter's words. "I can't change the past, Sarah, but if you're willing, I'd like to be a part of your future. I'm not the same man I was before. I've changed and I'm still changing. I want to be the father you deserve." As they talked, the initial tension began to dissipate. Sarah shared stories about her college experiences and her budding career as a graphic designer. John listened intently, taking in every detail of the life he had missed over the years. When Sarah asked about his new job, John felt a surge of pride as he explained his role in transforming Aldridge Properties. "It's not just about following the rules," he explained. It's about creating a culture of integrity, where doing the right thing is valued above all else. As they continued their conversation, John realized that despite all the challenges that lay ahead, he was finally on the right track. He had not only regained his life, but also his daughter's trust and a renewed sense of purpose in his journey. Sarah's eyes sparkled with a mixture of admiration and a lingering wariness that spoke of how meaningful this situation was to her. "Dad, I'm glad you've found something that gives you purpose," she said softly as the meeting drew to a close. Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Mom and Brian aren't ready to see you yet, but I'll talk to them. Maybe that will change in time." John nodded, feeling a spark of hope spark in his chest. "I understand. Thank you, Sarah, for giving me this opportunity." They parted with a hesitant hug, the promise of meeting again hanging in the air, while both knew the road to reconciliation would be long. In the weeks that followed, John threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. The ethics program he had implemented at Aldridge Properties began to gain national recognition, with other companies interested in adopting similar models. On a cold December morning, John found himself back at Pacific Garden Mission, but this time as a guest speaker. As he stood before a room full of people struggling with homelessness, he saw his own past reflected in their eyes. "I've been where you are now," he began, his voice firm and clear. "I know the weight of despair and the temptation to give up, but I'm here to tell you that your story is not over. Change is possible. It's not easy. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's worth it." As he spoke, John caught sight of Margaret in the back of the room, her eyes shining with pride. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this point, the depths he'd sunk to, the challenges he'd overcome, and the relationships he was slowly rebuilding. John realized that his transformation was not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, with each day bringing new challenges and new opportunities to prove his character. But now, he faced those challenges not with fear, but with determination and hope. As he concluded his speech, John's phone vibrated with a new message. It was from Sarah. "Brian wants to meet you. Are you free this weekend?" A smile spread across John's face as he responded. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was willing to face it, one day, one choice, and one act of integrity at a time. In that moment, John Baker understood that true wealth would not be measured in dollars or possessions, but in the strength of character and the bonds of love and trust he was building with others. As he looked out at the sea of faces before him, John silently renewed his commitment to living a life of purpose, integrity, and compassion. An act of honesty in a Chicago alley marked the beginning of a journey that would shape the rest of his life. If you are moved by this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also, check out these 2 videos here. They're sure to touch your heart in a deep way.